this screencast, I'm going to go over the structure of, well, part of the structure of the small intestine is just kind of an overview if you were to look at it in a microscope, and also a lot of the important enzymes that are involved in the digestion that happens along the way. In another screencast, we're going to be looking more at the structure of the small intestines and then how all of the products of digestion end up getting absorbed. Okay, so here's the one on, if you were to take a cross section of your small intestine is like 5 meters long. It's really, really long, and that's important. And the first half is mostly digestion. And then the second bit is a lot of absorption. If you were to take the end of that and do a cross section and look at it, you can see that it's made up of 2 muscle layers. So you have these longitudinal, muscle, smooth muscle, and then you have the circular layer, and that helps with peristalsis to move it down. So the circular kind of holds it so it doesn't go backwards, and the longitudinal will push it further down the small intestine. Then the inside here, this is called the mucosa. This mucosa is going to be really important in the absorption, and you see how it has lots and lots of surface area, okay? And that's going to be important. The more surface area, it means the more absorption that can happen. Now, looking at this in a micrograph, I'm just going to show you a few different ones because it can be kind of difficult, and I've seen a lot of different ones. But you notice here we have the muscle layers, right? And here's the mucosa. The name of these little finger-like projections in the mucosa are called villi, all right? So these villi, on the outside of the villi is the mucosa, and on the inside we call it the submucosa. And you'll see in another one, I'll show you, it's kind of cool. All right, so here's the muscle layers, and this is the submucosa, and then this outside along all these villi are the mucosa. So the submucosa is going to have all the blood and lymph vessels that are going to be important. And the mucosa itself is this layer. Now, see all these little extra tiny projections? These are called microvilli. So each of these finger-like projections is called a villi, and then it's got even more of these little tiny one-cell projections called microvilli. So these are pretty cool too. They increase the surface area even further. So this is the mucosa, and this is the submucosa just underneath, okay? And then, of course, you have those longitudinal and muscle layers and the longitudinal and the circular layers. Okay, so now one more picture showing you the circular smooth muscle layers, and then of course we have then the kind of this submucosa area, and then the mucosa along the outside. Okay, so here's just another kind of picture of it. All right, so then digestion. Digestion requires a lot of enzymes. And I love this diagram because it shows you where a lot of the digestion of the different macromolecules happen along the way. So carbohydrates, I mentioned in a previous screencast, we actually start digesting those in our saliva. There's salivary amylase, and that's going to take basically starch and break it down into maltose and smaller disaccharides, into these disaccharide bits. But starch will continue to be digested. All the carbohydrates can be continued to be digested all along the way, all the way through not so much in the stomach, but once it gets again into the small intestines, that will continue to digest them. Protein starts in the stomach. You can see this is where proteins start, and it continues to be digested in the small intestine. Nucleic acids like DNA and RNA, that's going to be happening in the small intestine, as is fat digestion. So these ones won't start happening until it's already in the small intestine. I'm going to go through on another slide and show you some examples of enzymes that would be good for you to know. Now, where do these enzymes come from? Well, some of them are, well, obviously the salivary amylase ones. These ones are made actually in the mouth, in the salivary glands, and then the pepsin is made in the stomach. But in the small intestine, there's both enzymes that get made in another organ called the pancreas, and then the small intestine will also make some of its own enzymes as well. So let's take a look at some of those. All right, first of all, the pancreas. See the pancreas? You've already done this on a drawing. The pancreas makes a whole bunch of very important enzymes that will get dumped into this same duct that comes from the liver. and it will dump those enzymes into the small intestine, okay? And the gallbladder will release bile salts, which help emulsify some of the fats. So the gallbladder is very important. So the bile gets made in the liver, it gets stored in the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will release those bile salts into the small intestine. So bile isn't necessarily an enzyme, but it is an emulsifier that helps break down a lot of the triglycerides, a lot of the lipids. Okay. So again, here's all these different macromolecules that we have to break down in our food. Once we break those down, we can then absorb them and assimilate them into our cells so they can be used to either make ATP or to make more, structures within our cells themselves. Here's that list of enzymes I promised you. So when we're looking at carbohydrates, we know pancreatic amylase breaks down starch into maltose. Okay, so that's an important one that happens in the small intestines. But the intestines themselves will actually further digest molecules. So there's enzymes called maltase that break down maltose into glucose. So you remember your disaccharides into your monosaccharides. And then we've got lactase that digests lactose into glucose and galactose, and sucrose digest sucrose into glucose and fructose. So now revisiting our macromolecules, if you remember, here's our disaccharides that we need to know, and here's our monosaccharides. So the polysaccharide gets broken down a lot by the pancreatic amylase, and then further along the way, those disaccharides will be from the small intestine, all of these enzymes. And of course, we know that lactase, the gene to make that protein, that enzyme, gets turned off in many adults. But some of us are lucky enough to be able to continue to digest lactose into adulthood. All right, proteins. Once it gets from the stomach, it's already been partially broken down, but then there's a pancreatic protease, so protease, and that breaks down proteins into shorter polypeptide chains. And then further along in the small intestine, you get these exopeptidases, and they digest peptides by actually removing a single amino acid at a time. So this is breaking the protein down into short polypeptide chains, similar to in the stomach. And then the exopeptidases do it even further in little tiny pieces. All right. And dipeptidases can digest any dipeptides left. I don't think you need to list all of these, but just realize that there's enzymes that come from the pancreas as well as in the small intestine that further breaks them down into their smaller monomer parts. Pancreatic lipase breaks down triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. And there's also pancreatic phospholipidases that break down phospholipids into their components. And you have nucleases made in the intestine that break down DNA and RNA into nucleotides. Now, one thing that's important, all of these enzymes, as we know from this previous slide, all of these enzymes are going to be working within the small intestine, but it's just where they're created, whether in the pancreas or not, is the only difference when we end up looking at that list.